Hello class, hope you are all well. This is the video I promised I would make to try and help you understand William David Ross's pluralistic theory of value. Before I delve into Ross's theory, I want to remind you regarding Kant's theory of the categorical imperative, and the reason being is it is sometimes easier to understand some of these philosophical ideas that present as very complex, but are actually a little bit easier once you understand them and less complex than they are at first blush when comparing them to other ideas. So I know you all understand Kant's theory of categorical imperative, or it seemed that the class did, but this will be just a quick refresher nonetheless. First off, both of these philosophers, Kant and Ross, rejected consequentialism. It's essentially an ethical theory that judges the rightness or wrongness of actions based on their consequences. In other words, if you do something wrong, but you get away with it without any consequence, then the action is deemed ethically right. Therefore, consequentialism could argue that the best action is the one that produces the most favorable outcomes. So both of these men were against consequentialism. They predicated their philosophies, particularly the ones that we're discussing, on duty. So this duty essentially is inherent and is the premise of both the categorical imperative and pluralistic theory of value. So remember, Kant stated,
Therefore, it is our duty to act in such a way that our actions could become universal law.
thus, there is a duty to your fellow humans to treat them as you wish to be treated. Second, treat humanity as an end and never as a means only. This spells out the duty to your fellow human with more clarity to ensure that you don't use your fellow human for selfish personal gains. So, the class seemed to be pretty clear on that, so I don't think I need to expound on it much more. But what I want to do now is give you a hypothetical so that you could better understand Kant in a hypothetical situation. And I'm going to do the same thing later when we get into Ross's pluralistic theory of value, and you'll see how it has a different outcome, but they're the same hypothetical scenario. So here's the hypothetical scenario. Let's say you're startled by a very loud banging on your door. Opening the door, you find someone you don't recognize, looks disheveled, is clearly agitated, and they immediately demand to know where your best friend is. You ask the person why they want to find your best friend. This person, whom you don't know, is talking very aggressively. They state that your best friend stole their laptop, their car, their mobile phone, and even their girlfriend. You know this is clearly untrue, but the person continues to rant loudly, stating they must find your friend to make the situation right. As the person says this last statement about making the situation right, he balls his fist and smacks it into his opposing hand. Clearly, this person does not have good intentions for your best friend, obviously. However, they are persistent in demanding to know where your friend is. The question, do you tell this unknown person where your friend is? Following Kant's philosophy, it is your duty to tell the truth in this situation. If we look at the universal law, the first premise of the categorical imperative, which you may recall is,
Therefore, it is our duty to act in such a way that our actions could become universal law.
thus, there is a duty to your fellow humans to treat them as you wish to be treated. Based on this premise, it would be morally wrong to lie to this person at your door because at some point you could be lied to in a similar situation or any other situation. Despite the fact that you may have reservations to tell them where your best friend is, it is still your duty to tell them the truth. So despite your reservation, Kant's philosophy would obligate you to tell the truth and tell this person where your friend is. After all, you would not want to be lied to in the future when you ask other people questions. As such, Kant, and this also goes for Mill's utility principle, propose one singular ultimate value, which leaves little room for interpretation or consideration of nuance and context. However, Ross's pluralistic, and I'm stressing that word pluralistic here, in other words, not one singular, as is the case with Kant and Mill, Ross's pluralistic philosophy would view this situation differently, which you'll see in a moment. Similar to Kant, Ross would argue that we do have a duty to tell the truth, but this duty must be balanced against many other duties simultaneously. So, what does that mean? essentially, Ross's pluralistic theory of value creates two distinct categories of duty. The first being, if you remember, prima facie duties, which has 7 items, are on screen right now. You are welcome to review those. They are important to know, particularly the 7 duties, although the book does include 2 additional items. The additional 2 duties, which I will put on the screen now, are also worth knowing. However, veracity, I feel as though that is fidelity, which the book does point out. Either way, it's important to know these duties because it's the way in which you're going to filter your ethical dilemma through Ross's pluralistic theory of value. So that's the first category. In addition to prima facie duties, Ross also identified duty proper, which is also called actual duties. According to Ross, duty proper are duties that are paramount given specific circumstances. So we're now looking at nuance and context of each situation. We don't have a singular outcome. We're now having to balance things. In other words, Ross is willing to consider the context of specific situations, which is where he diverges from both Kant and Mills in their philosophies. So Ross distinguished between the right and the good in ethical decision making. The right is an objective goal in simple terms, whereas the good is an action. Okay? So according to ethicist Christopher Myers, and this is a quote that I pulled from your reading, a right action is something undertaken by persons motivated by correct reasons and on careful reflection. In other words, they're thinking deeply about this. Moving on, not all right actions, however, will be productive of the good. So, unlike Kant, there is no formula for working through an ethical dilemma while using Ross's pluralistic theory of value. I know that may seem a little overwhelming, but I promise you it's much simpler than it seems at first glance. Unlike Kant or Mill, Ross's theory provides the user, meaning you, the leeway to weigh competing issues simultaneously. Think nuance and context here. And of course, that's going to change for each specific situation. It is actually not as abstract as it seems because it all boils down to you using your moral and ethical compass to determine the correct action in each situation. The important or the imperative here is that you think through the situation. So, Ross believed you, as a human being, have the capacity to weigh competing moral considerations within each ethical dilemma and determine the most appropriate ethical course of action. So going back to the hypothetical madman who's banging on your door, Kant's philosophy would obligate you to tell the truth to the person so that they can find your friend. However, Ross's philosophy would obligate you to consider the nuance and context of the situation. While you certainly have a prima facie duty to fidelity, which is truth, although the book does distinguish truth as a separate category, however, fidelity or truth, whichever way you want to look at it, that is not your only duty in this situation. For example, you have a duty to your friend, who you don't want to see injured or hurt in any way. You also have a duty to justice, as you know your friend did not do the things this madman is wildly accusing them of. You also have the negative duty of not injuring others, which could likely happen if you tell this person where your friend is, as it seems they have very nefarious motivations. So, unlike Kant, which would have had you tell the truth to this person, Ross allows you to think through a bit of the nuance in the situation. It's a more expanded list of duties than Kant, and it's sort of building on Kant by acknowledging the world is more complex than these very singular outcomes. So, in relation to media, journalism, and newsroom ethics, Ross's pluralistic theory of value is a very effective model because it's far more fluid and flexible in its ethical framework, as it does not have a singular outcome. It is pluralistic, which is more amenable to context and nuance in an industry that demands context and nuance. That being said, I think you'll agree with me that it's not as difficult as it seems when you're first encountering this philosophy. That's why I was encouraging you all to really stick with it. It gets easier, I promise. But don't mistake your capacity to understand this more simply as it being a simple philosophy. The primary value of this philosophy is that it acknowledges you as a human have the capacity to think deeply and rigorously. So while it presents as simple, it is nonetheless takes quite a bit of effort to work through all the considerations, the context and nuance here, when addressing an ethical dilemma. So I hope that helps. I have decided not to do an example in terms of media or news or newsroom, and the reason being, I don't want you to mimic my values. I want you to think through and understand your ethical values. I believe the hypothetical dilemma, as viewed through these two different philosophical frameworks, will help you to better understand not just the concepts, but how to use the concepts as it applies to news media. One piece of advice that I will give regarding this media ethics class is to first determine, generally speaking, what is the major theme of the dilemma. Once you identify this primary theme, then you can begin to examine the nuance and context of this theme from different perspectives and examine it through your chosen ethical philosophical framework. I hope this video helps. Please feel free to email me with any additional questions. I hope you all have a great night.